My guests this week have never been shy about telling others just what they think of them. Douglas Murray hotly defends his right to be right-wing and has been so critical of Islamic fundamentalism that he once needed a police guard. Francis Beckett is a historian and playwright who writes about retirement. His father was interned during the war as a fascist sympathiser. Lynette Burrows is the author of The Fight for the Family. She's a mum of 6 and runs a school at the bottom of her own garden. But let's stick with teachers' ability to teach sex education. Douglas, Francis has described the way that Lynn has described sex education teaching as ghastly. Do you think there is an age where it is appropriate to teach sex education to children, or do you have a concern about it?
No, I thought it was pretty ghastly too, but I think there's a truth there somewhere, which is that we are doing something badly wrong at the moment. I think that's fairly obvious. With the highest teenage pregnancy rates and so on, obviously it's not working, and I would just say that the answer that tends to be come up with is that therefore you should simply teach it earlier and earlier and earlier. I don't think it's the stage at which you teach sex education. I think it's what you're teaching and how well you're doing it that matters. And I think it's significant.
So if we look at the comparison with the Netherlands, where sex education can start as young as 4,
it can, but it very often doesn't.
And the average age at which young people engage in sexual activity is higher than over here, and their teen pregnancy rate is much lower. Is that, you think, not because of the age, but because the Netherlands gets it right with the content?
I think they get it right with the content in their society. The societies are obviously different. The Dutch society, for all sorts of reasons, has different tolerances, different laws than we do, and you have to adapt them to your own situation. But in Britain, we are obviously getting something wrong, and we have to change that. But I think simply bringing it forward obviously isn't the answer, nor is the answer that schools shouldn't teach anything about sex to any children. That's ridiculous.
Douglas, this is, as Dr. Jan McVarish has pointed out, this is not a value-free lesson, is it? No. Or can it be?
It can be, but under pretty broad terms. I mean, first of all, the simple biology, as it were, it should be taught as biology, as far as I can see, and you leave that till the stage at which they can understand that and what's more need to know about that. And I think the importance of the need to know basis, as it were. I think the reason why a lot of people are worried about 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds being taught sex education is because they think, why do they need to know at that age? But when you come to the years where you do need to know about the biology, then of course you have to be taught that. And you can be taught that as fact. You don't have to be given, it's not as it were opinion, how babies are made. And but then you come on to the other part of the issue, the non-biological part, as it were, about how you have loving relationships. And I think that can be done in a pretty values-free way, or at least in a way which everyone can agree on, which is to imbue children with the idea that whatever relationship they have or aspire to, it should be one in which they care for people, in which they respect people. I don't think anyone could disagree on very broad parameters like that.
Does this all smack, Douglas, of a sort of throwback to Eastern Europe in the Cold War?
Well, no, not at all. I mean, I think anyone who knows what happened in Eastern Europe during the Cold War can possibly make that comparison.
Informing on neighbours?
Well, firstly, I mean, as far as shopping illegal immigrants, which is what Cameron asked for, I mean, I think this is a citizenship question. I mean, if you are a taxpayer and you pay into the system, then people who have never paid into the system and who are here illegally, as opposed to legal immigrants, then of course they're costing everybody, and your duty as a citizen to stop that shouldn't be so much of a problem. And as for the thing of reporting on people who might well be becoming terrorists, I mean, again, I mean, if you think somebody is likely to be the sort of person who'd go and blow something up, then who wouldn't take an interest? I mean, in the days when the IRA campaigns were at their height, who didn't on public transport if they saw a suitcase? Who didn't look around and say to everybody, whose suitcase is it? Check it. That wasn't spying on people. It was just being a good citizen. I mean, otherwise, what do? Get off the train and leave the rest to it? I mean,
yeah, well, they should get rid of those before they turn on the citizen and say, you do the job.
But Lynette, I mean, that's not an either-or. I mean, we could, for instance, agree that the government has lost a lot of illegal immigrants,
yes,
and still want to help them. I mean, are you suggesting we just shouldn't help and punish the government?
No, I think it's a bad thing to ask people, citizens, to spy on one another.
They're not asking anyone
This
to
is not
spy.
the same as what you're saying about the bag left on a thing. Of course, that's common sense to say, whose bag is this? But to be sniffing round, making perhaps one or two inquiries
but nobody's been asked to do that. I have to, that's just flat out wrong. No one has been asked to spy on anyone.
Well,
the government has asked that where people are in a position of supervision over young people and they see somebody becoming the type of person who was a radical, they hear them espousing the sort of views that would lead to mass murder, then they should say something, and that is about being responsible.
Francis, you're
treading on extremely dangerous territory.
Douglas?
Nobody doubts that mistakes have been made, mistakes will be made in the future. No law or its pursuit is ever perfect. But I mean, there are cases, there have been cases like Rizwan's in Nottingham. And then on the other hand, there have been cases where people have not reported situations when they have actually been people who have aspired to carry out terrorist acts. There was a conviction a few years ago of a student in Scotland who had been looking at beheading videos on his university's computers. Nobody had reported him precisely because they feared that if they did, they would be accused of being prejudiced in some way. And that person was somebody who went on to be convicted for terrorist acts. So, of course, mistakes will be made, have been made, but we shouldn't pretend that this isn't something that should concern us.
Rizwan?
The individual that Douglas is referring to is Atif Sadiq. He was actually acquitted, even though he was convicted under the Terrorism Act. He was eventually acquitted and released, and it was declared to be a miscarriage of justice. I'd just like to clarify that.
But Haris Rafiq is Muslim director of Sentry, an organisation which counters extremism. Haras, you want people to report on each other if they do suspect that their views may be, I don't know, dodgy. Is that one way to describe it? But Rizwan says unless there's direct evidence of criminality, then that is not anybody's duty.
I think the government, alluding to the when it's talking about the Prevent review, it's actually alluding to tackling the motivation that drives somebody to carry out terrorist attacks. If we don't do that, we might as well all go home and pack up and do nothing. Actively in universities, there are organisations that are promoting the hate speakers and preachers who are actually promoting things like killing homosexuals, suicide bombings which are theologically justified, people who are in favour of domestic violence and attacks on British troops. And if we don't tackle the motivation behind the things that drive the pathways to somebody being radicalised to terrorism, we're actually going to have more problems. And I think herein lies one of the key problems. We're not talking about thought police, and we're not talking about motivation, and we're not talking about opinion. We're talking about organisations in universities where students, at least half a dozen ISOC members, have either been charged or waiting to be charged for terrorism. And we have preachers who are practising and preaching on campus without being challenged. And that's what I think we need to do.
Francis?
But you don't need to spy on people in order to expose that sort of thing. If somebody writes that they think every man ought to beat his wife up, well, you don't actually need a spy to say, hang on, there's something very difficult here. What we're talking about is where you suspect something, where, for example, as with the person we were talking to a few moments ago, he simply downloaded some material for research purposes that might have been downloaded by somebody with malign intent, and that was what got him into trouble. That seems to me the danger in what you're saying.
Can I just ask you a question then? If we have preachers that are coming on campus and saying that women should be beaten, that saying that attacks on British troops are justified, and saying to people, young Muslims, vulnerable Muslims, without being challenged, that if you don't believe in these views, you're not a Muslim, what should we do about it?
Those preachers, those preachers, yes. I mean, nobody is arguing that you leave those preachers alone. Nobody's arguing that you don't report those preachers. What we're arguing is that the students that they talk to must be presumed innocent, and and we shouldn't be trying to turn. Just let me finish the sentence. We shouldn't be trying to turn their lecturers into police spies over them.
I think that people, after going, sitting in on these lectures or on these speeches, if they start espousing the same views, we need to do something. If we don't, we're going to see other underpants bombers. We're going to see other people blowing themselves up on the streets of London. And what you're suggesting is that once we have people espousing similar views to these preachers, that we just sit back and do nothing.
Douglas?
I think that's complete nonsense, and we have to do something about it.
All right. Harris, thank you.
I absolutely agree with Harris on this. I mean, the point is this. Everyone's got themselves into a pickle on this particular issue because it's to do with Muslim students. But just turn it around for a moment. Imagine if a society at a university routinely, week in, week out, invited members of the BNP as the only spokespeople to students on campus. Not as one point of view, not even as one challenged point of view, but the only people. Now, the BNP happens to be a legal organisation, as some of the preachers are. But they're also, as everyone knows, a vile, bigoted, racist organisation. But we would absolutely report people who were preaching racist speeches on campus, and we should do it in this case too. But people are scared about tackling this because it happens to be racism coming from Muslims.
Since the government caused this whole problem with a very unthought out results of mass immigration, it's up to them to get it right, not to turn on the citizen and say, you get it right. It's almost impossible job.
Douglas, I can see you.
As I say, it's not an either-or. Both the government can improve its own record and individuals can play their part as well. But just quickly, this is actually about laws that are already in place being broken. There are laws in this country against incitement. And when there are people speaking at campuses like the one Abdul Muttalib was at University College in London, when there are people who are known breakers of that law, known inciters of murder of ethnic and sexual minorities, then that cannot be something which people turn a blind eye to, because they're turning their eye to the
Douglas,
law.
you are in the unique position in this studio in that you know the individuals involved. Do you not?
Yeah, well, as it happens, I know Adam Werrett and Liam Fox, and I think they're both very decent and honourable people, and I think they've had a week of having their reputations and their lives completely trashed by the press. And I do think it's worth saying that there's no doubt about it, there was some blurring of the boundaries that should have been addressed, should have been looked at, shouldn't have gone on this far. But the way in which this week the press has reported this as if, as it were, the problem was that Liam Fox was becoming the story, and that's why he had to go. By Friday, people were saying, well, he's become the story, it's a distraction, therefore he has to go. He'd become the story because people have kept on making him the story. A lot of stories have come out in the last week that are simply not
Which people
true.
had made him the story?
I think you mean newspapers.
Newspapers.
Yeah. But the thing is, it wasn't the newspapers that kept it going. It was Liam Fox kept it going by drip feeding information. He was continually, just let me make the point, he was continually giving as little information as he could. He said boundaries have been blurred. Not I blurred boundaries, but boundaries have been blurred. Well, there should be exactly the same rule. It would be no good for a rioter to go along to court and say, well, actually, the boundary was blurred between my television set and that television set.
But the point is, first, most of the things that have been claimed this week have not been proved. Most of them will not be proved. There have been a lot of sheer speculation thrown out in this case. But look, the point I'd make is this: we do, as a country, have to make some decisions about what we expect from our politics and how it's meant to be run.
Do you think anything? Do you think anything went wrong here? Do you think Liam Fox and Adam Werrett did anything wrong?
I can't see anything myself yet, and there may yet be stuff to come out. But I think that we're in the following situation. People are complaining when government have too many advisors who are paid by the taxpayer. They complain, as happened the other week with Nick Clegg, when there are unpaid people being exploited working for politicians. And now there's only one other way you can do this, which is for somebody to be paid by party funders.
But
Liam
Fox already had three advisors paid by the taxpayer.
You might need more than three to deal with the MOD.
Well,
but you have to do it briefly, sadly.
He may have been a very good defence secretary, but it's interesting that Adam Werrett was firstly a health lobbyist when he was at health, then suddenly became a defence lobbyist when Liam Fox moved to defence. It's all
that
very
may have been
grubby.
an error of judgment, but in terms of judgment at the Ministry of Defence, he showed terrific judgment.
Douglas, if we linked pension age to life expectancy, one organisation has said that somebody who's 17 now doing their A-levels will not be retiring until they are 77 in the year 2071.
I could believe that, absolutely.
And would that be a good thing?
It may just be fact. It'll just be something we'll have to find a way around. Neither good nor bad, just events will make sure it happens. Look, I mean, when the welfare state started, most men were expected to live roughly, I think, a year over their retirement age. And now it's around 15 years plus. This has been a huge change in the welfare state and the welfare state model, and in the model of how we live our lives. And, you know, the fact is just that economically we won't be able to pay for more and more people living longer and having more and more years of retirement. I mean, in America, by 2030, the number of people who are in retirement will have doubled, but the number of people in work will have only gone up by 18%. You can't support the retirees on that.